Liebes Publikum, ich begrüße Sie heute in den Räumen der Schelling Architekturstiftung in Karlsruhe sehr herzlich. Trude Schelling-Karrer gründete diese Stiftung 1992. Sie war damals beraten worden von Heinrich Klotz. Heinrich Klotz kennen viele von Ihnen noch. Er hatte 1984 das Deutsche Architekturmuseum in Frankfurt gegründet und im Anschluss hier in Karlsruhe das Zentrum für Kunst- und Medientechnologie. In ihm fand Trude Schelling-Karrer genau den Richtigen, der das Profil des Architekturpreises ausweitete für Architektur und Architekturtheorie. In dieser Kombination ist der Preis weltweit einzigartig. Die Stiftung verfolgt das Ziel, ich zitiere, das zukunftsträchtige, Bedeutsame zu fördern und fundiertes Wissen zu verbreiten. Aus diesem Impuls heraus war damals die Intention entstanden, mit einem zweijährig vergebenen Preis die Architekturdebatten aufzufangen und zu befeuern. Trude Schelling-Karrer selbst war Bühnenbildnerin und Innenarchitektin. Die Räume, die Sie hier sehen, hat sie selber gestaltet. Es fällt natürlich auf, dass das Motiv des goldenen Wandreliefs, was Sie hinter mir sehen, eine Urteilskraft zeigt. Es geht nämlich um das Urteil des Paares. Trude Schelling wohnte hier mit ihrem Mann Erich Schelling, dem Architekten, bis er 1986 verstarb. 2009 verstarb auch die Stifterin. Im Anschluss wurden diese Räume hier als Stiftungssitz umgebaut, wobei die sehr schön gestalteten Räume, die hier im Film zu sehen sind, natürlich vollständig erhalten blieben. Die Schelling Architekturpreise werden seit 1992 vergeben. Aufgrund der Corona-Pandemie sind wir allerdings mit dem Verleihungsrhythmus tatsächlich ins Stolpern geraten. Weil außerdem ja die Gremiumsmitglieder aus unterschiedlichen Ländern und die Kandidaten bzw. die Preisträgerinnen aus fast allen Kontinenten kommen, ließ sich 2 Jahre lang eine Präsenzveranstaltung leider nicht durchführen. Preisverleihungen und Präsentationen als auch die Laudationis werden wir künftig live im Internet übertragen und anschließend auf unserer Website dokumentieren. Heute erleben wir eine Premiere. Und wir hoffen, dass wir dadurch in einer größeren Öffentlichkeit diesen Diskurs zur Architektur und zur Architekturtheorie befeuern können.
Hello everybody. A big welcome to all of you for this day, for this ceremony, award ceremony of the Schelling Theory and Architectural Award 2020. A special welcome to our 4 nominees for the Architecture Prize: Chu Tian from Beijing, Lina Ghotmeh from Paris, and Ted A. architects from Palma de Mallorca. And the winner of this year's Theory Prize, Itohan Osayimwese from United States. A big welcome to you.
Why do we know so little about specific periods of our history? If the history of modern architecture is a construction, we need to ask who constructed it actually, to what end, and what is part of the established canon and what is not. We need to rethink the history of modern architecture from scratch, a demanding and very fundamental challenge, exploring new narratives of critical reflection to actually rediscover our present in the past. How can universities and cultural institutions communicate these new narratives at the beginning of the 21st century? Itohan Osayimwese's work is brilliant and very inspiring. She demonstrates how we can gain new access to society from archives, and how we can use this access to actually build a new intellectual mindset for the theory and history of our discipline. Architecture, as we know, involves not only questions of existence, but also of power. That's the complexity. So what does it mean concerning research? Firstly, it means that archival research becomes socially relevant when it succeeds in questioning and finally overcoming architecture's traditional claim to autonomy. And secondly, that architectural research becomes political when it opens a new discursive potential for our society. So, isn't one of the most important intellectual challenges for architecture schools today to continually explore and communicate this discursive potential? Itohan's outstanding work has laid the foundation for a new history and theory of architecture. Her observations are precise, her narratives are powerful in language, and her methods are intelligent strategies of political appropriation of history, and thus a very relevant form of critical thinking of our present. One of my goals has been to make an invention into the way we write and teach the history of modern architecture, she once said in one of her lectures. That's a very strong position. Dear Itohan, the Schelling Foundation's committee is delighted and very proud to award you this year's Schelling Prize for Architecture Theory. Congratulations.
I am honored to receive the 2020 Schelling Foundation Theory Award. Thank you to the members of the selection committee and the staff of the foundation for inviting me to share my work. My presentation today addresses a question of interest to all concerned with the past and present of architecture. How do we know architecture that is not here in this time and place? How should we know architecture that has not left physical traces on the landscape or even underground? And how can we know architecture that was not or is not of the now dominant European American order, an order in which vision and permanence are paramount? And what are the consequences of knowing or not knowing this architecture? Another way to approach this question is to think about how evidence works in the discipline of architectural history, about how our long-standing reliance on written and visual evidence severely limits our range of view, and how it has contributed to a restricted narrative of architecture's history. If we take the history of sub-Saharan African architecture as a case study, and any perusal of the shelves of an architecture library will reveal just how little we know about what must be a vast topic, given that humanity originated on the continent. One possible strategy is to excavate the thousands of texts about Africa's histories, written and published by European travelers from the 15th to the 19th century. By one 1980s estimate, there were over 700 books and articles on West and West Central Africa alone, published in Europe before 1865. Similar numbers are cited for Southern Africa, although fewer are cited for books published in about Central and Eastern Africa. So as a reminder, those numbers, 700, 700, and slightly under 700, so over almost 2,000 texts, really account for only texts published before 1865. The number of publications multiplies exponentially if we think about the period between 1865 and 1900. Now, there are notable exceptions to this reliance on European sources. We have letters dating from between 1509 and 1541 that were sent by King Afonso Mvemba Azinga of the Kingdom of Congo to kings and government officials in Lisbon and Rome. Many other Congo kings also wrote letters, and there are also judicial records from the Kingdom of Congo, that have been saved. More unusually, there are letters written by or on behalf of Queen Njinga a Mbande Ana de Souza of the Kingdom of Angola to Portuguese colonial officials in the 1650s. In addition, there are over 1,000 letters from local rulers to Portuguese colonial authorities, also dating from this time period from about 1650 to the 20th century, that were recently found in small archives across northern Angola. On top of all of that, we also have a collection of 19th century letters from the kings of the Kingdom of Dahomey, that is today's Republic du Benin, the country of Republic du Benin, that have been relatively recently identified in Rio de Janeiro. These documents are all in European languages, but research is revealing that Africa had many long, rich, and diverse writing systems from ancient times to the present, and these could potentially yield rich insights for historians. Nevertheless, the majority of sources that we have were written by European missionaries, explorers, traders, colonial administrators, and settlers. And in quantitative terms, these sources far outnumber both sources written by Arabic-speaking travelers and sources written by Africans by many magnitudes. Historians avoid European sources because they are biased. Products of their time and place, these sources are entrenched in ideologies of racism, Eurocentrism, colonialism, and imperialism that make it difficult for them to work as evidence of anything other than ideology itself. Rather than dismissing these sources entirely, and in light of the scarcity of alternatives, I'd like to think about the possibility of developing a new approach to writing the history of African architecture based to a greater or lesser degree on the grossly compromised European archive. An analysis of a series of 4 richly illustrated late 19th century German language essays, 2 of which you see on the screen right now, on the history of African architecture offers an opportunity to develop some principles for this new approach. The essays were published between 1894 and 1898 by retired Prussian military architect Hermann Frobenius. During his lifetime, Frobenius was well known for his books on military strategy, for predicting World War I in a famous book called Des Deutschen Reiches Schicksalsstunde, published in 1914. And he is also well known as the father of the first anthropologist of Africa, Leo Frobenius. But after retiring from the military, Hermann Frobenius seems to have suddenly developed an interest in African architecture. There's no evidence that he ever visited the African continent. Rather, following the well-known model of armchair anthropology, he synthesized over 5 centuries of European explorers, missionaries, colonial administrators, military officers, and other travelers' descriptions of buildings in Africa. He read and summarized a large number of works, including the work of the 15th century Portuguese explorer Vasco da Gama, who, of course, on his way to India, sailed around the Cape of Good Hope in modern-day South Africa and visited several cities on the eastern African coast, including Mozambique and Mombasa. Hermann Frobenius also read the 16th century Spanish, Muslim, Moroccan, Italian traveler known as Al-Hassan al-Wazan, also known as Leo Africanus, who was famously captured by Christian pirates in 1516 in the Mediterranean Sea and enslaved by Pope Leo X in Rome. Frobenius also read almost every major Portuguese, Spanish, French, British, Italian, and other European explorers of Africa. And you can see a list of those on your screen. In Afrikanische Bautypen, eine ethnographisch-architektonische Studie, published in 1894, probably the largest, most extensive of the 4 texts written by Hermann Frobenius, he argues against the prevailing 19th century European view that Africans were intellectually inferior. With this, he justified scholarly interest in African history, which he rather innovatively argued could be best understood using architecture. For him, architecture, unlike other cultural or biological markers, was relatively stable, and so the core characteristics of a particular group's approach to architecture, in his mind, could survive time, migration, war, natural disaster, climate change, and any other major transformation or event. You can perhaps begin to identify some of the assumptions embedded in this approach. The question of whether architecture was a response to external or internal stimuli, to culture, to environment, or to psychology, or even a local or a universal impulse was widely debated, especially among 19th century German architectural thinkers. Culture was paramount in Frobenius's understanding of architecture, but environment and psychology also played roles. In his effort to understand African architecture, he correlated architectural form and structure with race, ethnicity, geography, language, and history to create a taxonomy of African architecture. In his subsequent 3 publications on the subject, he refined this taxonomy. And those books include Die Moschebauten im Sudan, published in 1896, Die Erdgebäude im Sudan, published in 1897, and Afrikanische Hütten und verschiedene Geräte, published in 1893. On the surface, these texts sound like amazing sources for the history of African architecture, but given their provenance, we must query them even more than we typically question written sources. So I'd like to take a few minutes to reconstruct Frobenius's writing process. 19th century armchair scholarship has been criticized for its lack of criticality, but in a process that mimicked explorers' own approach to their work, which is to say that explorers typically, in planning an expedition, would read everything written by previous travelers to the region that they were planning to travel to. So in a process that mimics this kind of approach, Frobenius cross-referenced every architectural description that he read in one text with descriptions of the same region and the same buildings in other texts. He quoted and paraphrased both text and illustrations from his sources, and in some cases he even corrected what he perceived to be inaccurate information while explaining his rationale for making these changes. So we can see that Frobenius's was actually a critical practice. For instance, he relied heavily on Georg Schweinfurth's Artis Africanae, published in 1875, specifically because Schweinfurth argued that Schweinfurth only wrote about what he observed firsthand. So he was critical about other writers who wrote about places and objects and things that they had not seen themselves. And Hermann Frobenius was also critical of Henry Morton Stanley's tendency to exaggerate. For instance, Frobenius noticed in one instance where Henry Morton Stanley called some tall conical buildings that he found on a river in today's Democratic Republic of Congo uninhabitably narrow. Meanwhile, Frobenius, in doing his cross-referencing and doing his research, found a photograph of them in a Belgian publication, which suggested that they were not actually as uninhabitable and as small and as narrow as Henry Morton Stanley had suggested. But Frobenius's skepticism did not extend far enough. He did not question the very basis of the genre of the travel narrative or the paradigm of exploration as a tool for knowledge production. As Beatrice Heinze and Katja Rieck have suggested, the authors of these kinds of travel narratives were alienated physically, linguistically, and cognitively from the social realities that they were trying to represent. In fact, they were often only allowed partial access to places and sites and people that they wrote about. They usually did not understand local languages and had to rely on interpreters, and they frequently only very briefly passed through villages and cities while in transit to other places. Today, we too are alienated from these sources, to quote Heinze and Rieck, by time, by culture, by space, and because of differences in grammar, semantics, and rhetoric, by translation, since the texts that we read are translations of situations, events, and processes. We must therefore approach Frobenius's essays on African architecture as translations that have some unknowable relation to historical reality. The texts are certainly valuable as evidence of European assumptions about and attitudes towards and encounters with the African continent and its people. But to what degree can they function outside of this register and offer African perspectives on African practices and environments? It is certainly the case that explorers rely to a greater degree than has been acknowledged on local African knowledge. To give just one example, King Munsa of the Mangbetu kingdoms in today's Democratic Republic of Congo confused Georg Schweinfurth by claiming that his palace, the king's palace, was actually the size of a lake, and describing it and comparing it to the lake in grandeur and in size. So even filtered through multiple layers of translation, it is possible to locate some African agency and some African voice in these texts. Along those lines, I want to propose an inverse translation of these texts that would make them more useful for writing the history of African architecture. On one hand, this process takes a pragmatic form. I'm in the process right now of translating Frobenius's essays from German into English, which will make them accessible to a larger percentage of the people whose histories they address. On the other hand, I see this task of translating Frobenius as an opportunity to engage in a process similar to what scholars label back translation or retranslation. Writer Wangui Waguru posits diversion, introversion, extroversion, conversion, perversion, aversion, and subversion of a text as tools to counter the oppressive nature of translation in post-colonial African context and to piece the continent's histories and heritages back together. Similarly, translation studies scholar Tejaswini Niranjana asks, what happens in a post-colonial situation when bilingual translators challenge earlier Western versions through retranslation? Can one not include, under the practice of translation, the rewriting of history in the post-colonial period by reading against the grain of hegemonic representations? What this means to me for translating Frobenius is moving away almost entirely from the tyranny of a literal translation with the violence that it would perpetrate on descendant populations today. So a word-for-word literal translation has the propensity to continue and maintain the violence that originally happened in the 19th century when the text was written. So translating Frobenius in this way means correcting the inaccuracies in names of places and people that Frobenius inherited from his own sources, but it also means analyzing the origin and proliferation of these errors. It means substituting derogatory words with today's accepted scholarly terms, with the assumption that even the new terms might change in the future. Thus, the problematic word Negro that appears in Frobenius's texts numerous times becomes African, and the problematic word Hut, which is a colonial term, a derogatory term, becomes house or building. It means substituting Frobenius's sometimes unnecessarily lengthy descriptions with a now almost globally standardized architectural terminology. where Frobenius wrote, for instance, about a special hood mold over the door supported by posts, we could simply say a porch or a portico, since that is what he was describing, and since there was no essential difference between this porch and a porch in any other architectural tradition. Such a translation process, used in combination with sources written by Africans as well as with oral histories and the growing archaeological research about African sites, has the potential to correct our dearth of knowledge about the history of African architecture. Thank you.
So hello also from my side. Laudatio for Lina Ghotmeh. What is architecture about in times of multiple crises after Corona? Let me start with a quote by the Parisian architect Lina Ghotmeh, one of the young and central figures of architectural transformation in France. When you build today, it is vital to understand that you are always in a system of relationships. This is the credo of an engaged architect who participated at this year's Venice Biennale, How Will We Live Together, with a very beautiful installation. Ghotmeh is first of all a cultural wanderer between Europe and the Middle East, from which we can learn a lot. She grew up in Beirut, where she studied at the American University. Her youth in Lebanon, shortly after the Civil War, left its mark on her. In her methodology as an architect, she pleads for an archaeology of the future that is as meticulous as possible as the starting point of every design process. What does she mean by this? Analyzing, first of all, the existing urban and architectural stock in detail, examining it for its also painful historic meanings, and then linking them anew with the social and political reality of life on site. Ghotmeh combines this cultural translation work with a strong architectural concept. One example, in the case of the competition for the Estonian National Museum, which she won in 2005 as a 25-year-old architect, she did this by shifting the competition site that actually had been proposed and convinced the jury. Today, we can see the new building that spans the undulating terrain of the former military airport and not only exposes the topographical traces of the past, but also documents European history. Actually, Lina Ghotmeh is present in the debate about Paris as an exemplary 15-minute city. This includes her Masséna project, which is to become part of the ecological transformation of the French metropolis. The building is conceived as a teaching example for the linking of housing and office construction, urban biofarm, and documentation center. It resembles a Babylonian-looking wooden tower covered in greenery. But, says Lina Ghotmeh, architecture today must go far beyond the greening of the facades. With buildings like these, the architect has become one of the leading voices in the large-scale project of Major Anne Hidalgo, an exemplary for France and Europe under the label Reinventing the City. Thank you.
Born in Beirut, I grew up in a city that had been struggling from years of conflict. I had seen it unveiling its history through its gods, like an open archaeology narrating its multicultural past. This made me aware of how the same reasons that were behind the conflicts in this geography were also the reasons of an amazing spatial diversity and the multiplicity of conditions that would be able to allow a true living together. Architecture appeared as a tool of inclusivity, an instrument allowing to recreate one's belonging to a place, to an environment, a responsibility to rethink the quality of the act of construction as an essential brick to the making of our civilization, to the relationship to one another and that to the living world. Building by hand is hence an important act. Finding processes of making that involve the community, where architecture is able to raise questions and reinforce our relationship to our environment and that to nature. The memory of a place is hence a central matter in the making of an architectural belonging. Since the start of my practice, I found myself frequently dealing with sensitive context, one that had suffered environmental trauma or war, occupation, where architecture had to be more vocally an active tool that would deal with political, social, economical issues, sometimes on a scale of a nation, but through the microscale of the edifice. With my atelier, we have developed a passion for somehow very slow architecture, where on the span of 20 years, a lot of work has gone on few projects, where some span a process of 10 years of labor. In Estonia, more specifically Tartu, a provincial city of 100,000 inhabitants, the government had decided to build a 34,000 square meter ethnographic museum, a building that could be a cultural and multifunctional heart for Estonians. Controversially, the building sits on a conflictual land, a large military airfield testifying of the Soviet era of the country where many local riots had happened. The architecture that we propose for this building chooses to disappear in the context. It embraces its site and ties itself to the airfield. It transforms positively the history of this place and allows architecture to embrace the rurality of its site. The building became an activator of its context. Generous spaces are now used for concert, for learning, and for creative events that happen both outside and inside the project. Reconciling in a way the tumultuous past of Estonia with its present and future, the spaces of this large building disintegrate constantly to the human scale. The museum's architecture is now a place that unleashes the imagination of creatives of Estonia, a place for daily life, for encounters, for public life, even if set in the rural county of this country. This project had taught us to closely dialogue with climate, building with a tight budget, as Estonia funded this project with no help from the EU at that time. In Beirut, my birth town, I spent 10 years working on a project that tried to bring a new take on housing in the city. Here I was faced with a context that had suffered from post-war amnesia. After years of conflicts, the cityscape had been violently transformed, with developers' glass skyscrapers rising high in the Mediterranean sky. With the repetition of the same plan, these dictated the same way of living to their inhabitants. The loss of belonging, that of memory, of identity in Beirut, had contributed to the general political denial that society had embraced in the past decades. The operation of transformation of the city center, named Solidaire, adjacent to the site of our project, testifies for this process. Stone Garden attempts to draw another form of tower in the city, one that brings the vernacular back to the heart of the urban living while talking about memory, war, belonging, and the meaning of art and photography in the city. The construction process embraces the traces in the city, those of its organic nature, niched in the derelict ruins of its streets. In the absence of public parks in Beirut, this housing project embraces nature as part of its architecture and as a tool to individualize every living space, advocating diversity of living. The thermal mass of the building echoes vernacular and environmentally conscious architecture. Looking up from the street level, the tower rises as if an inverted ground labored by the hand of the local artisans. Artisans became part of the emotional process of creation. They were actually active in the making of this building that bears the traces of their hands. We manufactured custom tools of making, a large comb drawn to a floor height. This emerged after many clay tests we did at the atelier and site mock-ups. The building process ended up resembling that of a cooking process involving mixing, weighing, and drying. I believe architecture cannot be captured in a single shot. It should embrace every corner of its site. Buildings morph to dialogue with their surrounding. Inside the levels, nature is part of the living, and windows have been drawn like devices. They are tools that frame differently and question instantaneously the inhabitants' relation to the city. This building, as it is anchored in its ground, gives housing projects a public responsibility and a belonging to Beirut. Functionally, on the ground floor, a non-profit gallery is designed as an open platform for debates on art in the Middle East. After the explosion of last year, Stone Garden did not lose its hand-sculpted skin, nor did its nature collapse. It remained a hope testifying for the capacity of architecture to withstand trauma and to bring people together both physically and mentally. This work of the hand, the crafting process of architecture, is carried with my atelier on different scales, from glass making to artisanal brick construction. A responsibility to revive through architecture, crafts work, and sustainable techniques of making that are struggling to persist. With bricks, we are constructing at the moment a low-carbon passive manufacturing building in the north of France. We decided to build with the site's earth, reviving a local artisan brickmaker's atelier. 500,000 bricks were made close to the site, and masons were taught again how to construct by hand, with care and belonging. Reviving crafts through architecture in its various scales, urban, building, interior, and scenography, had led us to cross cultures and work in Arita, for example, in south of Japan. In this city, or in this province actually, our role as international architects was to render making ceramics attractive again for a young generation through a carefully designed exhibition scenography and a series of encounters. Architecture is indeed a sustainable platform to display the joy of culture and diversity.
Ladies and gentlemen, I have great pleasure in giving this laudatory speech on behalf of TEDA Architects, who are based in Mallorca, Spain. Let me begin by quoting from their website, and this is a statement that gives a very profound insight into their way of thinking and working. Quote, TEDA Architects is a workshop and a studio. TEDA Architects propose to move forward by looking back, without losing sight of the past and tradition. To continue to perfect tradition as an indisputable heritage. To defend regional identities against totalizing uniformity. We prefer evolution to revolution. End of quote. Now, technology continues to dominate all public discourse, including architecture. Technocrats and politicians continue to engage technological solutions to resist climate change. The majority of the Western public, of technocrats and politicians, are blind to the havoc and destruction that the uncritical embrace of technology has already brought to almost all environments and societies around the world. In this context, the position and work of TEDA architects is different. It stands out to mark a cultural position against naive technophilia. The office has a theoretical base, a very strong one, and a body of work that substantiates their approach. TEDA architects belong to the generation of architects that has transcended the simple binary opposition of modernism versus postmodernism. They understand any precedents, whether 50 or 500 years old, to be part of a cultural continuum with an endurance that demands our respect. Just as physical materials such as wood or stone, the one 50 years old, the other 500,000 years old, deserve to be treated with respect and knowledge. Precedents and materials are the roots from which TEDA architects' designs emerge to create transformed contributions to their cultural contexts. Without nostalgia, without self-aggrandizing pathos, the work of TEDA architects shows how respectful syntheses of contexts are possible everywhere, standing in line with similar architects who preceded them, whether they be Dimitri Pekionis, Hans Delgast, or Sigurd Leverens. TEDA architects offer an approach that understands their presence and actions as simultaneously specific in time and opportunities, as well as general and transcendent.
We are Irene and Jaume. We are TEDA Architectes, a tiny studio based in Mallorca.
The Mediterranean Sea could be understood as our territory, as our culture, as our history. We take everything from our territory: resources, materials, typologies, knowledge.
We used to say that we are where we are. This sentence plays with the verb be, and the be, stay.
We try to value the local peculiarities of that specific and tiny place where the work is located. We try to understand that small part of the world. We try to continue with the cultural and physical logic of the environment where the work takes place. We are intentionally rooted and gravitated in that precise place. In that sense, we are where we are.
No place is repeatable, and therefore any corner of the world is worthy of reverence. We try to set down roots where we have the opportunity to work. We try to understand how traditions work in every specific place we visit.
Every specific place has its specific identity. Identity comes from the Latin word idem, that means the same, then repeated. The identity of a place is created by the repetition of the same concept, of the same process, of the same solution, of the same material.
And that's how tradition works, repeating and repeating, once and again. Each repetition is a little bit different of the precedent. Each repetition transforms a bit the previous solution. With every repetition, the detail, the object, the typology, the result becomes better and better. Each repetition reinforces the identity of that specific place.
Working in continuity with tradition, we can contribute to reinforce the identity of the place where we work.
We try to move forward while looking back, without losing sight of the past and tradition. We try to be part of tradition, our undeniable heritage. We try to defend the regional identities in front of the globalizing uniformism. We prefer evolution to revolution. We understand that we are inevitably part of tradition.
Architectures without architects, common, normal, popular, ordinary architecture. Because nothing is original. We do not invent, we just try to transform. We try to work with the knowledge the tradition gives us. We try to bring this knowledge further.
We are interested in all concepts and how we can update them, how we can make them contemporary, how to make them eternal, how to become eternal with them. We try to use the existing as a tool. Tradition carries a huge amount of knowledge. We cannot ignore all this wisdom accumulated along centuries.
Tradition always works with the same logic, everywhere. What I have and what can I do with the things I have. With this simple thought, tradition becomes specific in every place. Tradition creates a very wide range of solutions. And what do we have in our local environment? Which are the local resources of the specific place where we have to intervene? Using local resources, we strongly contribute to reduce the CO2 emissions of a building, not only during its building process, but also along its life.
On one hand, we have local human resources, local craftsmen that work transforming local materials, a local net of people that perfectly know the conditions of each material. We also have local natural resources, like the mbat, the sea breeze that blows from the sea to the land in the middle of the hottest summer days. Then, to have cross ventilation facing the sea will allow to cool the building. And finally, we have local materials.
Which are the local materials of that place? Normally, the material resources that nature gives you are related to the climate needs of that place. In our island, in Mallorca, we have, for example, the local sandstone called marès, a stone that has a hygroscopic behavior that absorbs and holds the water molecules from the ambient. Inertia and hygroscopy are two building passive strategies to fight against our hot and humid climate.
But before using local materials, we must consider the possibility of reusing material. Most of the times we find material resources on the site, in the pre-existing situation or during the building process.
We try to give a second life to the materials, sometimes coming from a demolition, or from an excavation. We try to transform obstacles into solutions. We try not to waste. And not only reusing material, but also the whole building. To reduce is the best way to minimize the carbon footprint of a building.
Even a brick wants to be something. Say you can on a certain occasion.
But not only a brick, but every element we introduce on site wants to be something. A pavement and each tile of that pavement, a wall and every brick of that wall, a window in that wall, a lintel in that window. Every structure, each column wants to be something. Even the foundations want to be present. Even the electrical elements, switches, plugs, pipes.
Every element is a project in itself. But when do we have to stop? The perception of human beings is incredibly subtle. We have pores, hairs, and forms of perception and knowledge that invite us to grasp even the smallest detail. Reducing the scale is humanizing.
Small is human, small is beautiful. On one hand, we try to reduce the scale of the space, thinking architecture from its interior. Small rooms, small corners. Thinking about architecture in that way softens up the building and domesticates it.
On the other hand, to pursue and to be pursued down to the last detail. We never know when do we have to stop. We always want more. We always want to continue.
And at a certain scale, you can adjust your perception to the grain of the aggregate in a joint, defining the aggregate a reused one, coming from the old smart tiles, defining the aggregate with which is made the mortar for the joint between tiles. but it's never enough.
It's also human the perfect imperfection of the things done by hand. Local craftsmen used to work by hand. They used their hands as tools, understanding the nature of the material. To build by hand is the way to understand what you do.
And this is the way that we like to work. We used to work by hand. We used to think by hand. From the very first idea and the sketches to the very last decision taken on site, we used to think by hand. We think by hand, we draw by hand, we build by hand, we talk by hand.
But none of this makes sense without people. None of this makes sense without life. People and life must take ownership of architecture.
We love the moment when architecture starts to disappear in favor of life. The everyday life, the banal, the quotidian, the common, the ordinary, the infraordinary, the background noise, the habitual.
Much has been reported in recent years about the increasing urbanization of our planet. But what about rural areas? Growing cities and depopulated rural areas are in a relationship, even if some are currently talking about the revival of the countryside in view of the pandemic. In any case, new models are needed for rural areas. The architect Xu Tiantian shows how this can be done. After her education at Tsinghua University in Beijing and at Harvard University in Boston, Xu Tiantian opened her own architectural practice, DNA Design and Architecture, in Beijing in 2003. After a series of cultural and infrastructure projects in urban areas, she began her work in cooperation with Songyang County, a remote region in rural China, in 2014. 4 years later, in 2018, I had the opportunity to visit her projects in Songyang. It's a very idyllic landscape, but neither huge expansion of the transport infrastructure nor digital broadband coverage could stop the strong migration. Together with the regional administration, Xu Tiantian developed a new strategy of small-scale architectural interventions. The projects are spread throughout the region like a network of acupuncture. They activate the local economy, strengthen cultural identity, and care for the environment and community. Most of the projects combine production spaces with public and community spaces. A tofu factory is a community center. A sugar factory is a performance space. a bridge is a marketplace, and a theater emerges in the bamboo forest. Construction methods and materials are highly contextual, from stone to wood to bamboo, making use of existing resources and almost forgotten craft traditions. Often, the impact of these acupuncture points spreads and inspires further business ideas in the neighborhood. Xu Tiantian delivers inspiring solutions to one of the greatest challenges of our time. Her projects show what architecture can do and that good architecture works.
In the past 8 years, we have been mostly working in rural region, the agricultural Songyang County, with a small county urban center and hundreds of ancient villages in the region. During this process, architecture is the acupuncture intervention tailored to local context and heritage, to restore cultural identity and to reactivate the region by building up an interaction system. Architecture has become a healing treatment. For example, the Hakka Indenture Museum is to restore Hakka indenture history and to revive the traditional masonry building technique. The Camellia Oil Workshop is to reactivate the abandoned villager workshop into a production and culture facility. The Shimen Bridge is to renovate the abandoned and unsafe infrastructure into a pedestrian bridge and to reconnect the two villages across the river. The brown sugar factory is to improve the quality and price of village product as village intangible heritage, as well as providing public space as a village culture center. The bamboo theater is to build an open space in the bamboo forest by the natural resource. Compared to the often large-scale developments or iconic landmark buildings in urbanization process, the strategy targeting rural issues is rather micro-scale and human-centered approach. The issue of rural is global, but a systematic local-scale intervention could become the strategic and sustainable solution. It requires multi-function, more resilient architecture to achieve cultural, social, and economic sustainability. In other words, efficient architecture. It also challenges architects to expand perspective, to identify issues, and to initiate collaborations. One village used to be the most prosperous village in Songyang County with a glorious history. How to restore the village identity is a challenge for such an ancient village that is totally embedded by modern factories. Our first visit to one village was on a rainy day. During the conversation, the villagers were passive about the existing village conditions. But you can still identify the pride and honor when talking about the village history, especially the ancestor Wang Jing. This has inspired a new memorial hall dedicated to the ancestor in the heart of the village. While the building stays quiet on the exterior, the interior is articulated into a stage by mapping ancestors' key life moments with the building's structural corners. These 70 memorial corners, indicating the ancestors' life moments, become a stage play of Wang Jing's life and legend. The conversion of structural corners into memorial corners also frees up the interior space for cultural and public programs. The memorial hall is to restore village identity and bring back not only history but also pride and honor of this ancient village. On the opening day, hundreds of villagers dressed up for the memorial. It was an unforgettable scene for all of us. Caizhai village has always been known for its best tofu in the county region. Tofu is both agricultural product and the intangible cultural heritage for this ancient village. but the production quality from the original family workshops didn't fit into the food certificate standards. A new factory is programmed by the village entrance as a village collective economic entity and to upgrade the traditional tofu production. By integrating the original individual family workshops, this tofu factory functions as a village community kitchen. A covered walkway invites visitors to observe the production process in sequence and finally arrive at the tasting hall facing the ancient village across the river. With additional cultural and educational programs, this building has become a popular field trip workshop for young students. The factory is also a village life museum to showcase the tofu making as a village intangible cultural heritage. On the banners in a picture, it says, "A magical journey about tofu." The building requires a simple maintenance operation. More important, the factory is also a social structure. Through this factory, 2 villager unions are established, one as production union to operate the factory, the other one to grow organic soya beans to ensure the quality of raw material. The factory has not only inspired a more ecological agriculture, but also transformed the individual farmers' households into collective or co-op entity to engage in the market economy. Since the completion, the factory with its new production conditions have improved both the quality and price of the village tofu products. Around 30 young villagers returned home from cities to join the production union.
以前种大豆都是拉出去自己卖零售，现在工坊建成以后呢，由工坊里面统一收购，方便了村民，在价格方面也抬高了很多。
有4、5万斤吧，4、5万斤，所以呢，我就报名参加了到这里来，参加这个做泡豆腐了。比家里来说的，住的那个环境条件呢，肯定是好的，住的东西质量也是看得到。
每天要做200、300斤豆子，现在收入比前年增加30万块钱，效益提高了，经济也提高了。
The new Huimin Tea Space is a recent project in the neighbor county Jining, the only Shi ethnic minority county in China. This project is a production workshop to revive the traditional tea making, as well as providing cultural and leisure programs for visitors and local Shi villagers. The traditional Huimin tea processing in the workshop, together with tea planting and tea picking in the plantation, is the most intuitive agricultural production and live performance. 2 parallel perforated walls with patterns, composed of Shi pictograms, tell the story about Shi ethnic culture. Historically, the Shi people has a functional speaking language without a writing system. The Shi pictograph blocks on the walls are arranged vertically according to the meaning of the symbols, from the land at the bottom to the sun at the top, reconfiguring the Shi mountain, farming, and hunting scenes. The space of tea is not only to integrate production and activity, but also to reveal the basic law of nature and agriculture. In ancient China, a year is divided into 24 Chinese solar terms as the agricultural calendar. A day is divided into 12 two-hour periods according to each zodiac animal's activity pattern. In addition to the building volume, 8 tubes intersecting with both workshop and tea house bring in natural light to the central visitor lounge. Around the summer solstice, the direct sunlight of each zodiac hour is entering through the corresponding light tubes. From the sunrise rapid hour 5 to 7 a.m., dragon time 7 to 9 a.m., snake time 9 to 11 a.m. Around noon is the horse time 11 a.m. to 1 p.m. And then in the afternoon, the goat time 1 to 3 p.m., monkey time 3 to 5 p.m., and the sunset rooster time 5 to 7 p.m. The space of tea becomes a sundial to outline the trajectory of time as well as the life patterns of different species. Looking from the hills with a thin layer of water dissipating summer heat and reflecting the surroundings, the building transforms into a monument, revealing the basic rhythm of nature and biodiversity. Since our ancient culture, we have already acknowledged the world is built upon the basic law of nature, and we are sharing our planet with the other species.
So thank you very much for your patience, and we had a very engaged and open, frank discussion with 3 very powerful presentations, each of them very convincing in their own right, sharing an interest in local identities, local culture, local industry, local social production methods, and also how to translate traditional crafts into innovatory methods and also forms and architecture. And as a result of that, the winner is Lina Ghotmeh. So I'd like to congratulate Lina very much for having won this very tight decision. Extremely tight. There were only a few points in between. And I would like to thank the other 2 teams, Xu Qianqian and Teda Architects, for your participation. I think your presentations, as I said, were extremely strong, and I think in their brevity carry a powerful message to students and architects alike. So congratulations, Lina Ghotmeh, for being the award winner. It would have been nice had everybody been here, but we are only able to share this moment now, and I invite my colleague Ludwig Wappner to address the rest, and to invite the other members of the jury to join us.
Together. Congratulations also. Yeah, 3 wonderful teams and 3 wonderful nominees, and with Itohan, a very wonderful series winner of the Schelling Prize 2020.
Thank you so much, everyone. Congratulations to everyone.
Congratulations to you, Lina.
I'm so overwhelmed, actually. The works of my colleagues are so wonderful. I really dedicate this award to both of you as well. Thank you so much.
Have a nice day and celebrate the winning project. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.